So hello and welcome along to segment 5 of Your Brilliant Brain at Work. And today we're going to be exploring teams, silos and collaborative working. So without further ado, let's get started now. We're going to be thinking about the team from the lens of the human, the computer, and of course that limbic chimp brain as well, and beginning to add the exploration here to what we've already discovered to really help maximize our understanding of what is happening around us so that hopefully we can thrive in what can be sometimes very collectively difficult environments. So in terms of team, how would we see the differences between the way that the human brain might view the team and, for example, the chimp brain? So here we are, is the human take on what a team is, a sort of group of people all working together on something that has the same goal, the same sort of benefit, outcome, whatever it is that you want to call it, and typically that they're doing that in the service of either an employer or some other form of organization that's drawing all of these collective efforts together, shall we say. You'll notice here that what the human is contributing is very, very valuable. It's things like expertise, skill, knowledge, or perhaps time and energy. Each of these things, very valuable resource that, if you like, it is giving to or sharing with other members of the team, or indeed the organization itself, depending on how it is set up. Now, when the environment wrapped around all of this is good and optimal, that in itself is going to feel rewarding to the human, and that was likely to make the human want to give even more of that stuff, because it becomes a sort of self-rewarding process of giving something valuable and receiving something valuable in return. Belonging, meaning, purpose. These are all enormously important themes for the human part of the brain and for us as individuals operating from that humanity center. Of course, the limbic brain is going to view team as slightly different. The limbic brain has a slightly different relationship with the concept of team. And very often you won't necessarily really see that in action until there is a threat to the team or individual members of the team. And here is when we begin to notice that whereas the human part of the brain might very well regard the team as a collection of similarly leveled adults and colleagues, the chimp will see things through a slightly more hierarchical lens and will also view that group as a bit more like a troop or perhaps a tribe. And I think tribal is probably the best way of thinking about this. It's a more tribal, instinctive sort of response. And if you're wondering what that might look like, you probably don't need to go much further than watching a football match, where you can see football fans in a very tribal sort of space, very emotional, very emotionally charged, very much more tribal than perhaps they might be were you to meet them in another situation. So the chimp brain, very much viewing that collection of people from the position of being their troop, their tribe. Now, that's not to say that they're all going to get on brilliantly and there'll never be any arguments. As you could see if you watch any nature documentary, that's not true for chimps, and it's certainly not true for humans either. There are likely to be relationships within the troop that are closer than some others. We might have rivalries within the troop, and certainly we might notice a certain jostling for that all-important status, hierarchy being very, very important to the limbic instinctive brain. But one of the most important things to wrap our heads around about the limbic response to team is that give them a little while and team becomes full of familiar people. Even if they don't necessarily get on very, very well, that relatedness, that connectedness of simply working with them, day in, day out over a period of weeks, months, years, creates a sense of familiarity. And it's the familiarity that's of interest here, because the familiarity also brings with it a certain degree of security, because they now know one another. And because they are all operating in the same sort of space, they probably all have similar viewpoints on what's trying to be achieved, how's the best way of doing it, what are all the silly decisions that other parts of the company have made, what are the things that they're not being listened to on, and so on and so on. So they have quite a considerable amount that connects them, even if that connection is actually against the rest of the company or against other teams. It's still a form of connection. So what we have here is a lot of like me. And if you remember, I mentioned somewhere else before, humans, and particularly the limbic brain, likes like me. It likes to surround itself with familiar others, because familiar others are less threatening. We know what to expect. We know that they're less likely to disagree with us. We know they're less likely to come up with other ideas that make ours look bad, especially around what we're actually trying to do, because broadly speaking, we probably all agree on what needs doing and where the bits are wrong, and so on and so on. So broadly speaking, troop is going to feel more familiar, and therefore troop brings a certain sense of familiarity and safety. So should that troop be perceived to be under threat, and it's very likely that the members of the troop are going to stick even closer together. They're going to close ranks and defend one another and the troop itself. Now, here is when we begin to notice some perhaps less helpful behaviors, especially if one troop, one group, one team has decided that they do not like another group, another troop, another team. And actually, they are both, if you like, in a very limbic state towards one another. Here we might see some of the less helpful behaviors in the actual workplace. We might see members of each of those different teams refusing to collaborate or share resources with another member of another team. We might see them doing things like withholding information, withholding skill sets, deliberately withholding certain things that are going to be valuable to the other team so that the other team doesn't succeed, because that's going to make them succeed more. And everything is going to be compared against how much can we cause them trouble so that we look better or we do better. So here we enter a very sort of competitive, if you like, limbic sort of space. And a lot of organizations really struggle with this, because if enough of their teams are beginning to sort of fall into this, we'll stick together, thank you very much, and we won't cooperate across departments or across teams, then it starts to make everything feel exceptionally difficult. But if we're not careful, it's a space we can arrive at very, very easily. Now, of course, humming along in the background and to a degree guiding and shaping individuals and the team's experiences of what is happening around them is the computer, with all of its knowledge and wonderful information. Of course, from last time around, we'll also remember that it's carrying some stuff that may not always be very helpful, such as its expectations of what should be happening in certain situations, what team members should and shouldn't be doing, what other departments and other teams should and shouldn't be doing. And of course, when it decides that something is less than great, it is likely to flag up to the limbic brain, to the instinctive brain, that something somewhere needs protecting. And therefore, we are more likely to see those unhelpful limbic behaviors. When its expectations are being met or exceeded, that, of course, is where we are most likely to see input from the humans, and a really human-centric environment where people are more likely to cooperate, collaborate, and share resources. The challenge here is that the difference between the environment that allows humans in their teams to thrive and the environment that is likely to generate a more limbic, chimp, tribal response are all too easy to lose sight of when we have so many other things that we need to be thinking about, such as profit and loss and all of that kind of stuff. So it's very easy to lose sight of how important it will be to create the environment that's going to allow teams and their individuals to thrive. Because when we don't, we get one of those situations that organizations find particularly challenging to overcome. If you like, it's the result of not being aware of the fact that our teams are beginning to fall into groups that like one another, trust one another, and avoid other teams, other departments, other groups that they consider to be other or the enemy. And of course, the way we describe that is the organizational silo. As you can see here, as you perhaps read that description there, when we're looking at this through the lens of the brain, not for how everyone thinks it should be, but for how it really is, this all begins to start to make sense. Of course, we're likely to get silos if we don't have the right environment to stop those silos from occurring. But with our time and our focus on increasingly tight budgets, deadlines, staffing numbers, and so on, we don't often have the time and the space to stop and think, goodness, is our overall environment here making silos more or less likely? In fact, I would go as far as to say that from my point of view, silos are going to happen unless you are intentional about them not happening, because they are the natural result of an environment that feels suitably unsafe or threatening to the individuals within the teams that they have decided to begin to batten down the hatches. They have decided that they're not willing anymore. They're pulling right back on their contribution across team lines. They don't particularly want the challenge of a differing perspective or a differing point of view. And they certainly are not willing to share their precious resources like knowledge and skill and time and energy with others that they would consider to be the enemy. Now, of course, once this is coming across one way, it is very likely that the rival team will almost certainly do something similar coming back the way. And before we know where we are, we've got, well, almost the equivalent of like a turf war, or at the very least, set of battle lines with one group over here and one group over here, and an increasingly large gulf of silence and uncooperation sitting in the middle. From an organizational perspective, this is hugely challenging, especially in an environment where we have so few folks actually doing the doing these days because of such enormous pressures and costs. Those folks getting along well, sharing their resources and their knowledge and everything else that's meaningful becomes even more important. But as it becomes more important, the pressure sitting on it becomes greater, and the time spent thinking about what needs to happen to make it happen becomes scarcer and scarcer, making the reality of the silo really more pressing and likely now, or just as likely now as it has been at any point in time. As teams hunker down, hang on to the work, hang on to the knowledge, hang on to the expertise, and hope to goodness that that is going to keep them safe against an uncertain future.